Welcome back, friends. I'm so excited you're in for a treat today. I have Brittany Piper on the podcast, which I wouldn't be surprised if many of you are already following on Instagram. If you resonate with my content, with my podcast, you're going to be obsessed with Brittany. So let me introduce her and then we'll get into it. Brittany Piper is an internationally renowned speaker, author of Body First Healing, somatic experiencing practitioner, and expert in sexual violence prevention and trauma-informed care. Over the past 13 years, she has delivered more than 400 programs across 3 continents. Her work has been recognized by the U.S. Army, the Department of Justice, the Laura Bush Institute for Women's Health, Cosmopolitan, Elite Daily, and others. As a rape survivor and leading advocate on sexual violence prevention, Brittany speaks to tens of thousands each year. She's also a forensic neurobiology expert, love it, conducting trauma-informed trainings with the U.S. Army and sex crimes detectives. Creator of Heal with Britt and founder of the internationally acclaimed Body First Healing program, Brittany continues to inspire and lead in the field of trauma recovery. Brittany, welcome to the podcast.
Yay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. So I would first of all just love to hear your story. It is really powerful. When I first found you on Instagram, was immediately drawn in by your vulnerability, but not just any regular vulnerability. It was vulnerability about some really intense stuff that you've been through. And I think out of all the stories I've heard or even seen online, you probably have tons of reason to just hate people, hate the world, be this bitter, shell of a human, and you're not. You're quite the opposite. So, whatever you feel like sharing, would love to hear your story.
Thank you. Yeah, so my journey kind of starts at birth and I'm gonna fly through some of this just because I think that the aftermath and the road to recovery is so much more important, but maybe just to give people some context as to where this all started. So for me, when I was born, I was actually taken from my mother and put into foster care because at birth, because there was methamphetamine found in her system and in my system. And so that kind of started or catapulted this experience of trauma for me. And I was reunited with my mom after a few months. And so, I grew up with mom around, but as I've come to learn as a somatic experiencing practitioner, and soma means body oriented. So we work a lot with body memory in the process of healing trauma. Body memory starts to form around 7 weeks gestation in the womb. And so for me, I was very much so living in this very toxic, stress fueled, drug fueled environment. And that shaped a lot of who I became, especially in my earlier years. I grew up with a lot of anxiety, fear of abandonment, and then when I was in high school, my brother was tragically killed in a car accident. And I came from a family where you took all the hard stuff and you just threw it under the rug. And I don't know if it was the generation that my parents were born in, boomers are kind of like that, and that's what they were taught. But I remember my parents being back at work like the next week after my brother passed away, and I think that for some people that can be a good coping mechanism, but I realized in my early 20s that avoiding was not the same thing as healing, and that eventually it's going to catch up with you. And so, yeah, in my teenage years after my brother passed, that started kind of this experience of wanting to numb. So, severe alcohol abuse, pill addiction, just a very messy and hard time in my life. And then when I was 20, I was sexually assaulted by a stranger who helped me change my flat tire. The trial process and the aftermath of that assault was probably, what I often say is it was probably worse than the experience itself. There was this trial experience that was drawn out over 2 years, which is what a lot of, perpetrators and their defense team will do is they will postpone the trial as many times as humanly possible as a way to almost emotionally beat down or wear down the victim until they drop the charges. And so that happened for me 9 times over a 2 year period. And every time that happens, you kind of have to go through like a dress rehearsal. You have to prepare for trial. So you have to meet with your legal team again, go through the tape statements, depositions, practice being on the witness stand. I mean, it was like exposure therapy
Yeah.
to the extreme level. And I was really dissociated at that time in my life. And so on the outside, people thought like, wow, she's handling this really well, because I was so muscled, I was muscling through and armored up. But behind the scenes, I was back to a lot of those destructive patterns, which I now know is just self-protection, the drinking, the self-medicating. And it all kind of came to a head. So the trial finally happened at the end of that 2 year period. He was sentenced to 60 years behind bars, which is kind of unheard of. And I thought all along, once he gets convicted, if he gets convicted and sentenced, I'll be okay. Life will go back to normal. And that did not happen for me. I was still in those really crappy relationships. I was still heavily drinking, almost more so now, because I didn't have this thing to distract me. And so, not even 30 days after the trial came to an end, I found myself in a jail cell. I was out one night with my boyfriend who was drinking and driving, and I always say that's a really good indication of where I was at the time in my life. I was 22 years old. I'm 36 now. So my boyfriend got pulled over, arrested, and when the police officers went to pull me out of the car, I had this flashback in my impaired, drunken state of my assault happening in a car with a strange man. And I went back into a trauma reenactment. Essentially, my nervous system went back into a fight response because I was overpowered during my attack. And so I ended up in jail with 2 counts of battery on an officer with injury. And it was in that jail cell for 3 days because my parents didn't bail me out. Tough love. They're like, you need to learn your lesson. But it was in that jail cell that I wasn't able to lean into the alcohol, the drugs, the crappy relationships, the distractions. And in that cell, there were really profound things that happened in my body that I had never experienced before. There was trembling, shaking. Like I've never gone through drug withdrawal, but when you envision that in your mind, it's almost what it felt like. It's like my body was purging and letting out a lot of these things, decades old emotions that I had never released. And so I left that jail cell feeling very different in my body. And that made me really curious because I had been in and out of therapy most of my life. And I'm like, what just happened in there? Like, that was really interesting. And then on top of that, when I went before the judge for processing, she knew who I was from my assault case. And she said, we're going to drop the charges, but you need to learn to live with your pain better.
Mm.
And that for me, I always say, and I mention it in my book, that was kind of like my concrete bottom, not my rock bottom, but that jail cell was my concrete bottom. And this realization that she didn't say you need to learn to get over your pain or get past it. You need to learn to live with it. And all I had ever known was you get past it, you move on, or you avoid it, you run from it. And so that really was a profound season of my life where I really kind of pivoted and postured myself towards my experiences. And, as you said, the whole better, not bitter. And I'm like, how can I allow these experiences to make me better and no longer bitter? Because I was heading down that path. Yeah, so that's kind of my personal story, my me search before I got into the professional world, my research.
Brittany, and I followed you for a while, but there's details in there I didn't even know. So thank you. One of the first thoughts that comes up is, gosh, how limited our system is when it comes to even the interaction of you being charged with battery. When if we had a more trauma-informed society, this is not a quick fix, it's a systemic thing. But if only there were more, context in that situation, knowing you were just a victim having a trauma response. You're not this threat to
Mhm.
a cop that's probably stronger than you, I'm gonna guess, in that moment.
Yeah,
Um, so there's a million things I could talk to you about. The last thing I'll note after your story is it reminds me of one of your pinned posts on Instagram where you learned that I wasn't too much. It was just my capacity to hold these feelings was too small.
yeah,
So you're speaking to this nervous system work, this body work of learning how to rewire and expand it enough to be able to hold what emotions, really exist.
yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you.
absolutely. And yeah, and I think speaking to the trauma-informed world, and that's a lot of the reason why I work a lot now with military violent crimes units, first responders. It baffles me that they're not that this trauma-informed concept is not taught from like
Yeah.
the day one on the job. And so I was living in Rhode Island back in 2018 to 2020. And I started working with the Rhode Island Department of Corrections because I realized, well, first of all, when I was behind bars, I came to this realization like I'm behind bars at the same time as my perpetrator. And that was kind of like a whoa moment. And I realized that we were kind of one and the same. During the trial, they talked a lot. The defense didn't really have a leg to stand on. There was a lot of evidence that this was a clear assault. But they spoke a lot about his past, how he came from this really troubled past. He was raised by an aunt as one of 15 kids. He had poor schooling, mental, physical health problems. And so he was dealt this hard hand in life, and he allowed that to make him bitter, not better.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really opened the door for me in recognizing that, yes, hurt people, right? We know this, but are people given, if there was more trauma-informed care and procedures instead of, taking violent offenders and putting them back out on the streets, why are they not going through some kind of rehabilitation program and getting down to the root cause of their behaviors? Because these are just trauma responses instead of being like, okay, we're going to put you into a reentry program and this is how you do an interview and this is how you fill out a resume. So working with the violent offender program in the Rhode Island Department of Corrections, 92% of their violent offender population had adverse childhood experiences. And so, yeah, we could talk an entire episode about that. But yeah, just kind of speaking to that's kind of what catapulted me in that space as well, is recognizing um, we're all, we are all the product of our environment. And just changing behaviors is going to do nothing if we're not getting down to the core wounds and the root of these issues.
I mean, I can't imagine more important work, this work that you're doing. Anyone in the trauma informed somatic space, this is literal crime prevention. This learning emotional regulation, especially from a body perspective, it is that. And I think about even my own kids. I'm teaching them all the somatic F bombs, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop, and they know them. And in moments that whatever they're triggered or frustrated, I'll ask them like, what F word right now? And they'll be able to name it. And I think, gosh, if we had had this, if the boomers generation had had this, but it's just really, really powerful the work that you're doing. And I'm curious what you think of, and if you've heard of Kim Kardashian's work with this, with the jail system.
Yeah, I think she's doing a lot of the um, what's it called? It's right on the tip of my tongue. It's actually something that I almost did. Yes, I'm familiar with her work. And I can admire it.
Hmm.
Because she looks at the inmate population as they're more than just inmates and this label and putting people in boxes. They're humans, just like the rest of us. We're all very flawed people. And healing is, they say that it takes a village to raise someone. It also, in many ways, takes a village to help someone heal. And I think that people deserve a second chance. And this is in no way, by the way, saying that people who've done bad things that they should be excused, but I do think that it should be considered, right? We can use their past to help inform and explain how they got here. So yeah, it's more so that I do think people should be held accountable, but we should also be offering them the opportunity to be better, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I think that that is part of what she is doing.
So, Britt, I'm going to edit this part out that I'm saying right now, but I want to go a different route with this conversation now. I'm going to save the
Yeah, sure.
jealousy.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Uh-huh.
something's coming up more intuitively.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that more. I see so much in our society and our culture that we live in helps perpetrate this, I believe, but this bad othering, of seeing others as the enemy. And if anyone were to see another human as an enemy, I think you'd have every right to. No one would blame you if you're like, let me hunt him down, even though he's in jail. Let me go like even send hate mail or, add to his suffering because of what he did to me. I don't think anyone would blame you, but I'm curious how you feel towards your own perpetrator now and just your thoughts in general on this whole thing that is so normal
Yeah.
as a human race, this bad othering.
Hmm. Yeah, I think my perspective, I can have a bit more of a compassionate lens because even though it was a very short time in my life, because I was on the other side. Um, I I was on the other side where people looked at me like there was something wrong with me, whether it was my drinking. I mean, in college, I remember I went off to college on a Division I lacrosse scholarship. And I went to a very nice, kind of prestigious school. And our team had all these accolades for being a merit-based team. So we had one of the highest GPAs in the country. I was always like a B or C student, but that's besides the point. However, when I went off to college, I had this opportunity to kind of start fresh. In high school, I felt like people looked at me with the girl as the girl with the dead brother. People kind of pitied me. And so when I went off to school in New York, I'm like, I'm going to start over. I can create a new identity outside of what happened to me. And so, however, that didn't bode well because then I started heavily, heavily drinking. And within my first semester, I ended up in a hospital bed with alcohol poisoning. And I flatlined at the hospital. And I remember sitting in the basement of the athletic center with my coach and my assistant coach, and them screaming at me, calling me, they were female, by the way, but calling me every kind of horrible name in the book. You've tarnished our reputation. This is not a good look for us. And I remember my assistant coach looking at me. She was sitting next to me, and she was talking so loudly, screaming so loudly that like I literally felt her breath on my face. And she said, everyone has a past. Get over yours. And it didn't take but a week for them to push me out of that school. My punishment was to do like sprints in the morning and suicides, and essentially like we're just going to make Brittany pay for this. But then they also ostracized me and made me sit on the bleachers while they made my teammates do sprints for a couple of weeks. And my teammates, these people who I had become incredibly close with, who I felt like were my peers, my sisters, they began to really resent me and hate me. And so I think that we're kind of ingrained to look at other people who have pain and who don't know how to deal with it as what is wrong with them, rather than asking the question of what happened to them, right? Because we don't just end up this way. There is something in our life that has created this kind of environment. And so, yeah, I think because I've been on the other side, because I've been ostracized, because I've been in a jail cell, even if it were for a short time, I recognize that I was again heading down that path. And thank goodness I had a judge that saw that, I know who you are. You're the survivor from that sexual assault case. You need to learn to live with your pain better. Like she didn't judge me. This judge did not judge me. She gave me compassion and she gave me a second chance. And I feel like we're really quick to, as you said, other people or make them the enemy when there's any kind of discomfort or conflict. Setting boundaries is great. Pushing people out and cutting them off and stonewalling them because they're behaving in a way that you don't agree with. Um, I don't know that I can get on board with that. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I can have a little bit more of an empathetic lens because I've been on the other side, I think.
That makes sense. When you flatlined, did you have a near-death experience?
I don't remember it. I
Mhm.
don't I that whole and even that season of life is all a bit of a haze. Like I remember bits and pieces of like waking up, but barely. Yeah.
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 Yeah, I just feel like you have so much evidence that you could gather a case for to even turn that bad othering inward too, of like, I'm bad. You
Oh yeah.
experience punishment, being screamed at, like even it sounds like in your family, even if it wasn't intentional, some emotional abandonment or neglect, things being swept under the rug, being ostracized. I think all of that is perfect ingredients for you to be able to turn in on yourself and believe I'm a bad person. And we know that that flows out. However we feel about ourselves, that's going to flow into other people and our relationships.
Oh,
What
yeah.
did you practically do if you did identify with that at a point to have a gentler, even compassion towards yourself from a somatic lens?
hmm Um, I relate to that more than you know. That's kind of been, that was you could say the voice in my head for many, many, many years is that you know, I think when we talk about like toxic shame versus healthy shame, which is a topic that comes up in the somatic experiencing world, like toxic shame is healthy shame is, oh, I made a mistake or I did something bad. And I'm sorry, that's healthy shame. Toxic shame is internalizing that and saying, I am bad. I am the mistake. And I think a lot of my upbringing, I probably felt that way, which is why I became so anxious and so clingy. And then, yeah, around those really difficult seasons of life, because there was a lot of self-blame, self-hatred, shame, also the assault. I certainly blamed myself for it. Why did I let him into my car? What was I expecting? I remember even the police article, the articles that came out after the assault and some of the police officers. I remember there was a closing sentence in one article and it says, the police officer says this rape holds lessons. And then it essentially just went on to say that I should have trusted my instincts. She shouldn't have let him into her car. Again, the kind of final takeaway was it was my fault. And so I internalized a lot of that. Um, from my mom telling me on the way home from the hospital after the assault, like, why were you drinking? Just screaming at me. There's a lot of really difficult conversations I've had to have with friends and family since then about how maybe they could have handled that better. But yeah, I internalized a lot of that. And I think that when you experience something like an assault, like just kind of going into the somatics, of this, um, survivors are kind of conditioned to feel shameful about it, which I think is why so many don't come forward. In addition to that, 90% of assaults occur between the victim and someone that they know. And so my case is actually very rare, a stranger down a dark, empty alley, Law and Order, SVU. This is not everyday experience. And still, there was a lot of blame and shame in my experience. And so we wonder why survivors don't come forward. It's because there is so much blame and shame. So, anyways, all that to say, when you experience assault, there's kind of two roads to healing that run parallel. First of all, there's the road to healing that is with yourself and your body. It's like
Mhm.
learning how to live in this body again that has experienced something that no one should ever have to experience, but also your body stays very much so in this kind of, survival state. And that was definitely the case for me. And there's now new somatic imprints on your body, certain positions, certain ways that you are touched, certain styles of pleasure and intimacy. What used to be a green flag for you can now be a complete red flag. And so it's navigating this really foreign territory where you have felt so maybe connected and comfortable in your body. And now you're like, why do I brace when my partner comes to touch me? Or why did I just go flush when, someone comes in to give me a hug? What is going on? So it can be really confusing. So that's number one. And then number two, there's also the path of this is a relational wound. So your trust in the world and your trust with people can be completely shattered, right? And especially if it's someone that you know, which most survivors do know this person. And so there is that path as well of not only am I healing the imprints of what happened to me in my body, but I'm also healing the damage that was done in my relational world of how can I trust people, and so sometimes those paths cross, sometimes one is further than the other, but I would say somatically from a shame perspective, also 70% of survivors, when they experience assault, they will go into a freeze response, which is what we call, in this case, tonic immobility. So they essentially feign or play dead. And it's important to note this is something that happens outside of the mind's awareness and outside of the mind's control. When you experience this, your amygdala, your threat center takes over your thinking brain. What also happens is your muscles, your musculoskeletal system goes essentially flaccid. And so we don't fight back, right? It's like we're going into hibernation mode. The memory centers of the brain become disrupted. And so that's why we might not remember the experience in its entirety. Our vocal cords, our larynx and pharynx deactivate so we don't say no. And so there's so many survivors. I've worked in a lot of rape crisis and trauma centers all over the world. And that's the experience of a lot of them is they live with this shame of, well, I didn't fight back, so I must have wanted it, or I didn't say anything, so I must have been okay with it, or I wish I could, but I didn't. And so therefore, I'm not going to tell anyone because I allowed it to happen. And I think it's important for people to know that your body was allowing you to survive in the best way that it could, and that we don't have control over that. Um, so I think that's also important to note. But when we're in that kind of chronic freeze, or what we call a collapsed or shut down state, the body can kind of stay stuck there. So we become very dissociated. We have higher levels of epinephrine, numbing hormones, so we can feel like kind of like just this walking version of ourselves, but we feel very disconnected from the world, from others, and from ourselves. And so the first thing that we want to do is rather than like, people talk a lot about like, I just want to take my power back. And that can happen in a lot of ways. But one of the first things that you can do, and I know it sounds so simple, is like learn the language of your body again. Like something as simple as like, can you lean into your senses and just notice like what is it like to hear birds chirping today? What is it like to feel the sun on your skin? And what this does by working with the sensory motor system and bringing presence and connection back to the body, right? You're fighting against these numbing hormones, but you're like, no, I'm not numb. I'm here and I'm present and I'm feeling. That can help the body to essentially thaw out of this chronic freeze response. And that feels gentle. That's not like I need to like go punch a punching bag because that could be really overwhelming. It's actually simpler than we think. It's just, can I be present in my body? Can I be present in my environment and just notice how that feels? So that would probably be step number one.
Brittany, this is so, so important. So much of what you touched on. First of all, I'm glad you just touched on when we're in that freeze response, the most helpful thing is not to do a sacred rage session or, like shaking, these things that you see sometimes on somatic Instagram accounts as like a good thing to do. Yeah, in a time and place, maybe if you're in a more fight or flight response, those are great to do. But you're talking about this frozen response that you said 70% of sexual abuse survivors go into?
Yep. They will
Yeah.
70% will go into tonic immobility. Yeah.
Tonic immobility. So the name of the game here is more gentle. And even
Yes.
on a smaller level, this morning was an interesting morning in my house, and my daughter had just tantrum after tantrum, and I went into my own freeze response. And what helped was I was like, I need to get out right now. And it was hearing the birds chirping, and it was feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. It was calling a friend and being like, I just need human connection right now. I actually feel kind of dissociated after that and like the room's closing in. And so I'm so glad you brought it up because so many do experience the shame afterward of what's wrong with me for not speaking up. When you understand what your nervous system is doing and the wisdom of it, how it's keeping you alive, this is where you can start to dissolve a lot of the shame and embody more radical self-acceptance, self-compassion, which is absolutely necessary on a healing journey. I tell my clients there's no amount of somatic tips, tricks, tools. They're all going to go in one ear out the other if you're drowning in a shame storm. So, primary is to dissolve that shame. And you see it too, even in, you mentioned playing dead. And, you see that in the wild of animals playing dead and how it can help them survive sometimes, like go unnoticed by a predator, or if they're in a situation where they actually are about to get killed, that epinephrine you mentioned, the numbing hormones, it's like God's or nature's mercy on them, that if they are actually killed and mauled by a predator, they're not going to feel the pain as intensely. So, in a situation, in an event that you've been through as traumatic as sexual assault, like that is the mercy of nature and the way your nervous system is designed so that you didn't have to feel all of those feelings and feel your felt sense body sensations in that moment.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of that the surfer girl, Bethany Hamilton, who got attacked by a shark and
Yeah.
her arm was bit off by a shark. And she said, I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel any pain. And the people that were with her was like, you just seemed catatonic almost. She didn't scream, she didn't fight. And so really, really important, Brittany.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the context, we say that the three essential elements for the nervous system, this is from the polyvagal lens. I was trained at the Polyvagal Institute too, and the three essential elements from Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory, is choice, which gets taken away during assault, connection, which gets disrupted during assault, and then context. And context can go out the window when our logical mind comes off. But healing is so, especially with assault, all three of those things can be so incredibly vital. And so what you're talking about is that context piece. Like I remember again when I got out of that jail cell, my body felt really different. And I was just so curious, I'm like, what happened to my body? What just happened in there? And that's when I started diving into, books from Peter Levine, like Waking the Tiger, the developer of somatic experiencing, and realizing how animals in the wild, their nervous systems, these wild animals, their nervous systems mirror human animal nervous systems, our nervous systems, and how we have these same instinctual, ancient, primal responses, but as humans, we also have this conscious brain that's so good at overriding, right, our natural impulses and our experiences and our emotions. And so the context for me, which was a lot of the education and understanding, wow, that's why I responded the way that I did. And that gave way for this shame to really kind of melt away. And what took its place was, yes, that compassion, yes, that acceptance, but also in some ways, like this awe and this gratitude for like my body knew what to do the entire time. And it's always been here. It knew what to do when I was in the womb. It knew what to do when I lost my brother. It knew what to do when I experienced this assault, and it's going to continue to carry me through. It has all these innate tools. If I can just get better at listening to them and allowing those tools, right, to happen and to take place. And so yeah, for some people, you can get to that point where it's like this shame turns into radical acceptance and almost like gratitude for, yeah, my body was there the whole time and it knew exactly what to do.
It is so powerful.
Yeah.
And it makes me think our deepest wounds, they often happen in relationship, but so does our deepest healing. And you touched upon earlier, how it was that parallel journey of I also needed to learn how to repair in relationships with other people. Can I
Mhm.
trust other people off after that? You mentioned the imprints it left on your body and even your posture. And I think that's really interesting and can be a huge like leverage point of awareness when you can understand, like, let's say do tend to slouch your shoulders more, or on the other end of it puff your chest out if you're feeling threatened and you need to
Mhm.
like claim your stake. That all of that is wise too. It is your body doing its one job, what it was designed to do: protect you, keep you safe in moments where you felt unsafe. And from what I've heard from a lot of abuse survivors is they did tend to, after, the incident, either dress with baggier clothes or, make their posture concave, cross their arms, like anything to hide their
Mhm.
body. So can you speak to that, the specific imprints that were left, and how you, through somatic work, helped get back to a place of safety without forcing yourself into a new body posture?
Yeah. Yeah. So we say that, in the somatic world, we work a lot with body memory. And so instead of working with verbal memory, we work with nonverbal memory, and that shows up in our viscera, so our organs. So, for instance, the way that our stomach clenches when, we hear loud noises, or the way that our heart starts to pound. It shows up in our muscles, it shows up in our digestive system, it shows up in our endocrine system, our hormones, our hormone patterns and our instincts and our impulses. So the way that we might clench our jaw, or the way that we might look downward when someone who we don't know looks us in the eye. our body is always, always telling a story about what we've experienced in the past. And so, as somatic experiencing practitioners, we use Peter's work. He studied animals in the wild, so ethology. So we study humans in our sessions. So like we'll
In
pick
the
up,
wild.
yeah, in the wild, yeah. So like we'll pick up on little things like I can notice little micro movements or like when a certain diaphragm just activated. Or when someone's tongue just dropped down into the bottom of their mouth. Like there are certain patterns that the body does, and it's always telling a story of where our nervous system and our stress response is at. And so we work with those patterns to essentially create new ones. So for instance, if I'm noticing that whenever we talk about, a client brings up her mom, and I'm noticing that her shoulders, just like you were saying, they're starting to go in. So the shoulder diaphragm starts to collapse. I might call that out. We might notice it. We might track the sensations like what's going on. Maybe there's constriction, maybe there's numbness, maybe there's a little bit of dissociation. And then we might try and introduce a new pattern or a new impulse. What would it be like to even just imagine right now? Maybe we don't have to do it, but just pulling those shoulders back, right? Or just imagining that your spine, one vertebrae at a time, were to start to rise. What would that feel like? Or can we just raise our eyes and see what naturally happens with the shoulders? And usually there's like again, there's a pattern, we call it coherence, that happens through the rest of the body. And what we're doing is we're allowing the body to do now what it couldn't do back then. And that's kind of what we're talking about when you said earlier, like creating a bigger capacity to be with what used to feel like too much back then. And so over time, we touch into these little patterns that can start to get the body unstuck. Um, and then that is actually what starts to change our thought patterns, our behavioral patterns, our reactions. The body is in the driver's seat. Um, we have this wonderful thing called the vagus nerve, which is like the longest nerve in the body, but it's the information superhighway. And it sends messages in both directions. So from the brain down to the body and from the body up to the brain. 80% of those messages, though, are efferent, which means that they're sent from the body up to the brain. Only 20% are afferent, which is brain down to body, which means your body has a lot more say when it comes to how you show up in the world, how you show up in your body, and how you show up in relationships. And so um, that's why my book is Body First Healing, because if we are only working on mindset, cognition, conventional therapy, and not also including the body, we're missing a big part of it. But all that to say, these are small little things that someone can start to do when we do want to start to come out of that posture of, as you mentioned, hiding. So that's what we call your state of dorsal, which is like a shutdown or kind of like a freeze response. But you can imagine it like a turtle shell. You're hiding and you're withdrawing. You are retreating and going into hibernation. And what's most important here is disconnection. So we disconnect from the body, we disconnect from the world, and we disconnect from others. And so there are simple body things that you can do. And I did notice this in my own posture, but also you don't notice it as much now. I'm looking on the screen. You can see it a little bit. It's gotten a lot better. But after my assault and for a number of years, my right shoulder, and I talk about this actually quite a bit in the book, my right shoulder dropped down about 2 inches lower than my left. And the reason for that, and I went to umpteen chiropractors, no one could figure out what was wrong with me. And until I started working with an SCP. And one of the first things they said was, yeah, you have a thwarted defensive response in your body. I was
Mm,
like, a what? Can you like what is that? So when my assault happened, I had mentioned earlier, I went into a fight response, but I was overpowered and he was sitting on the right. And so the right side of my body went into, especially here, a collapsed response. And so this side of my body, and also there are videos of me talking back then. I did an interview, and the right side of my face is kind of drooped down. This was an incomplete response in my body. And so working with a practitioner to touch into, again, not going straight into rage, like you said, we do not do that in somatic experiencing. Slow and gentle is the game. Peter always says slower is actually faster when it comes to nervous system and trauma healing. So we worked with just moments of anger of like, what was something that pissed you off recently? Yeah, when I texted someone and they didn't text me back, but it said red. And then but it was something like really important. Okay. And as you're talking about that right now, what do you notice in your body? Because I was really dissociating. It's like, oh, I'm noticing I'm clenching my fists and like there's some heat in my armpits. And it's like, can we allow that to just stay here for a minute? And then we'd go more into more deeper and more deeper anger. But we were growing that container and that capacity for me to be with a healthy fight response, which is necessary and vital, right, to setting boundaries. And so over time, what's interesting is my posture started to come back to baseline and started to change. Um, so I don't know if that answered your questions, but there are small things that you can do in the somatic world to start to touch into some of the power, the choice, and agency that has really kind of been stripped from you. Um, and then, of course, doing that in a relational framework that looks different, but you can do that too in kind of a relational capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wild that you had to, especially the 2 years of trial, relive that experience so much. I'm
Yeah.
curious if looking back, you still would have gone through it. Because there's on the one hand where I'm like, girl, don't let him off the hook, right? Like you finished that out. Yes, badass Brittany. And then the other hand that's like, oh my God, that's what you were talking about, the 20-80% with traditional therapies. So often it's the retelling, the rehashing, the opening that can of worms that can keep people stuck at best, re-traumatized at worst. So
Yeah.
that part of me is like, whoa, would you have done anything different?
Looking back, I don't think I would because I think that now, of course, that's with knowing the path that it took me on. I don't think it would have taken me into a space where I pursued a degree in women's studies and concentrations in gender-based violence and violence prevention. I don't think it would have taken me all over the world in this exploration. My assumption would be is that if I didn't pursue the trial, I probably would have not pursued any of this in the same way and the same patterns, the same predictable path I had been on for most of my life, which was just pretend like it didn't happen.
Mhm.
And in some ways, I will say, I think that at first, when I got into this work, so I started working overseas as I was a documentary photographer for rape crisis and trauma centers. I was a conflict photographer. And I was working in, pretty remote regions of the world, places that aren't necessarily safe for women. And I would go for months at a time by myself as a solo worker. And I'd work with nonprofits and non-government organizations. And it was very much so a trauma response. I was putting myself right back into the same kind of stress-induced, threat-fueled environments that my nervous system was now so used to being in. And so knowing that now, and I talk about in the book too, like I remember like I'd be doing this incredible work that felt so meaningful to me and working with survivors, yet on the way home from work, I'd stop at a liquor store and get alcohol and I'd get completely blackout drunk by myself in an Airbnb in the middle of some remote country. And so, all that to say, and this isn't for everyone, but for me, I know that my experiences, I like to hold the perspective that they happen for me, not to me. And while I wish that there were certain things I didn't have to go through, I knew that I wouldn't be here at this point that I'm at in my life where I feel like I can do such meaningful work had I not gone down that path that I did. And also when I do things, I do it at 150%. So if I'm gonna go for this trial, I'm gonna go for it. If I'm not gonna go for it, then I'm gonna pretend like this never even happened to me, and I'm never gonna talk about assault. I'm never gonna talk about healing. Like I would have gone in the 150-degree
Yeah.
opposite. And I honestly don't know that I would be here today. I was in that bad of a place. So
Yeah, Brittany, thank you so much for sharing your entire story. I think the last question I want to ask you that I know listeners might be wondering is, can you exist now without triggers, having gone through what you've gone through? And whatever it is, whether it's been sexual assault for some women, it's abandonment, betrayal, abuse, whatever they want to know, is it actually possible to get to a place where I can go into those situations and actually be okay?
yeah, great question. And the answer is we cannot get rid of our triggers, but we can get better at processing them. We can get better. And so that's kind of goes back to what you were mentioning earlier is that, so for instance, let's say like it's not, let's talk about like an emotion that's really uncomfortable for some people, which is anger. Okay. It's not that the anger is too big, it's that our capacity to be with the anger is too small,
Mhm.
right? And when it comes to triggers, triggers are perceptions of threat that are received through our body and through our senses. So something that you smell, something that you hear, right? Something that you see. Like we're always picking up on people's body language, their tone of voice, their prosody, their eyes, right? These things we're always scanning. Think of your nervous system as a security system. Always working in the subconscious, working in the background, working through the body to ask the question, am I safe? Am I not safe? Am I safe? Am I not safe? Always looking for signs of welcome or warning. And if you've experienced something in the past that was not safe, your body and your nervous system is not going to forget that. And it's going to warn you, alarm, 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 whenever there's something that triggers that perception of this is going to happen again.
Mhm.
And so it's less about getting rid of the alarm, and it's more so about when that alarm does come up, do I now have tools do I have the capacity and the resources to move through this trigger so that I don't get stuck in this activated place? So a nervous system that's dysregulated, we like to say, is one where the security system is broken or faulty, like it's constantly alarming for threat, even when it's not there, or it's not alarming for threat at all, even when it is available. And so a regulated nervous system is one that can be with both moments of danger and not get stuck there and moments of safety as well.
Mhm.
And that's a big part of it. I think we often focus on like the triggers,
Mhm.
but from a foundational perspective, it's more so like, how can we actually notice moments that feel good and feel okay? Like the way that that person just smiled at me, that actually doesn't feel like a sign of warning right now. That feels like a sign of welcome. And how am I noticing that in my body? Right? The more that we can bring intention to that, the more that starts to disarm the nervous system. So, anyways, long story short, we can't get rid of our triggers. We can just get better at being with them.
So well said. Girl, this was a pleasure. I knew we were going to run over. I knew this episode was going to go longer than I typically go, but I just love picking your brain. I love your story and just the way that you are changing the world in such a big way. So tell people, I'll link it all in the show notes, but where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on good old social media at Heal with Brit, two T's, not like Britney Spears. And if you want to learn more about the work that I do or working with me, just go to bodyfirsthealing.com. I have the Body First Healing program that I created back in 2018. It's a 6 month somatic trauma recovery program. And that is the foundation of my new book, Body First Healing, which comes out next week, March 25th, actually,
So it'll
worldwide.
be out by the time this airs. Grab
Yeah,
it.
exciting.
So exciting. Thank you again for being on, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Appreciate the powerful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. It was awesome.